folks, Conifer High School is really unique because it has a ton of different habitats in its own little ecosystem. And we call this mountain ecosystem a montane ecosystem. Or sometimes you'll hear people talk about a coniferous forest ecosystem. And that's where we live, most of us who live up here in Conifer. And there are some pretty telling characteristics of a coniferous forest or montane ecosystem. We almost always have conifer trees. You may find a few aspen trees in an ecosystem like that. We always have wild grasses that grow. There's a lot of really, really tall, what we would call softwood trees, which are these coniferous forest trees that we see in our ecosystem. Now, ecosystems can be further subdivided into what we call habitats. And a habitat is kind of like a special zone that exists within an ecosystem. And so we're standing in one of the habitats on our Conifer High School property. There are actually 5 of them that we're going to visit today. This one is what we call a south-facing slope. And if you take a look at the sun, it's right over here. Using the sun as kind of your directional locator, can you guys point which direction is south? Yeah, it's exactly right over here. And actually, if you use your compass on your cell phones, if you have that app, and you point it this direction, this is almost exactly south. So as we look at where we're standing here, we're all sort of facing south. And that's this particular habitat. It's the south side of a hill, of a slope. Now this slope has been developed, and you can see we've cut into the side of it. But you can imagine that this was just one big rolling hill, right? At one point before we built the school here. And so as we look at this particular south-facing slope, there are a couple of things that are going to make it really unique. And before I tell you what those are, I want you to brainstorm 3 abiotic factors that you think are really, really important to this south-facing slope. What are 3 non-living things that are impacting the habitat that you see here? And as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about what plants do you see growing here? What sorts of animals do you think might be living here? And I want you to make note of those things too. And we're going to give you about 3 minutes to be thinking about what are 3 abiotic factors that are really influencing this habitat. See other types of pine trees over on this side. So we don't see Douglas firs really. We don't see any of our blue spruces. We don't see any lodgepole pines. It's all ponderosas on this south-facing slope, and that's really common for a south-facing slope. The other thing that you'll see is this stuff right here. This is a juniper bush. These are also really drought resistant, and if you've ever pulled junipers at your house for mitigation, you know their roots don't really go down. They go out across the top layer of the topsoil, and that's because they're really, really drought hardened, so that they can grow in really dry places like a south-facing slope. In your notes for my class Station 1, Habitat 1, I want you to write down what kind of plants you find here and make sure you have 3 abiotic factors.
All right, so this is a north-facing slope, and some things that we notice here, as I walk over here, I notice that the temperature is a little bit cooler. We are getting a little bit less direct sunlight. If you happen to live like I do on a north-facing slope, then you have snow that sits by your house for a huge part of the year. So even into May and June this year, we had tons and tons of snow by our house. A north-facing slope gets less direct sunlight, so the temperatures are a little bit lower than a south-facing slope. And we notice that there's a lot of different types of trees here. So we see more aspen over here. We see trees, pine trees, with a lot shorter needles over here. Those are mostly fir, and then we also have some spruce trees. And those tend to prefer wetter soils than ponderosa pine trees. Ponderosa pine trees that are on the south-facing slope, they can tolerate a lot drier soils, but the trees over here prefer soils that are a little bit more wet. I want you guys to brainstorm, what do you notice about the soil here? So I want you to dig down a little bit, compare it to the soil on a south-facing slope. If you had a garden over here, what would be some of the advantages of being over here? What would be some of the disadvantages compared to a south-facing slope? Over here, I don't remember seeing any moss over there on the ground. So those would be, there's a little bit less sunlight, but a lot richer, somewhat richer soil over here.
Bird habitat here at Conifer High School. It's one of 3 types of wetlands. And if you were in my class, there is a spot for you to define a wetland. And I'm going to tell you that definition. I want you to write it down. If you're in Mrs. Anderson's class, you might want to jot this down as well.
Yeah, question 1.
Question 1. So a wetland is a habitat or ecosystem that has running or standing water that exists in the ecosystem throughout most of the year. I think technically it's got to be at least 9 months out of the year. So an ecosystem that has running or standing water for the majority of the year. At Conifer, there are 3 types of wetlands, and we are lucky this year that this is still running. This is called a riparian wetland. A riparian wetland is the area of land that borders any streams, lakes, or rivers. So it's the area of land that borders any streams, lakes, or rivers. And just like we talked about abiotic factors in the other 2 habitats, I want you to talk with the person closest to you about a couple of abiotic factors that you see here. What do you notice here?
There's mud.
Abiotic factor, but it's an important one. What's another abiotic factor besides just the water? Yeah, Brooke mentioned the mud, but you might write that down as lots of moisture, right? In a riparian zone, there's going to be a lot of moisture in the soil because that water is constantly saturating the topsoil. Does everybody have at least 2 things?
Yeah.
Okay, Mrs. Anderson, what else do we need to add to yours?
We are good.
Okay.
We are good.
Good job, folks.
A marsh is a different type of wetland, and some of the characteristics that make a marsh are standing water. So if you guys come, you'll eventually come over here and you'll see that there's tons of water. So standing water, there's a lot of algae, and you can see that in between the plants that are here. There's cattails. You guys see the cattails over there? And then these plants that have edges are called sedges. So you can remember that sedges have edges, and that has a nice little rhyme to it, so it's easy to remember. And then there's also lots of grasses here on the edge of the marsh. Marshes are really important habitats for birds, so lots of different species of birds. Lots of bugs like to live in here, mosquitoes. If it's a little warmer, I think we'd see lots of dragonflies. And then some amphibians like to tend to live in marshes. Let's see. I want you guys to write down 2 abiotic factors that you guys notice that kind of drive some of the biotic factors in this area.
Riparian, we visited marsh. This is the last wetland that exists on our Conifer property. And take a look out there. What do you notice about the landscape? If you were to describe it in 1 word, what would you use to describe that? Oh, say again, Brooke, really loud.
Flat.
It's really flat. Now think about where our school is and kind of up there on the hills, and think about where this wet meadow is. What do you think this meadow collects when it's rainy or snowy?
moisture.
Yeah, this is a runoff area, essentially. And wet meadows are almost always found in valleys. A wet meadow is described as a wet meadow because when you walk across it in the wet season, your feet squish and it feels like a sponge. And I'm sure you guys know of some places where you've been where it looks like it's going to be really dry and you walk in it and it's just kind of squishy. That's pretty indicative of a wet meadow. Now, a wet meadow has about 2 to 3 centimeters of moisture that just stay on the topsoil at all times until the dry season happens. And we are just entering that dry season, so when we go down there in a few weeks, it won't feel wet to you. But there are many months out of the year when it is really wet down there. What kind of plants do you see down here? What are the majority of plants that you see? Grasses, yeah, absolutely. Grasses and what we call forbs, those are flowering plants. A wet meadow will have a lot of different colored mountain flowers during flowering season, which for us is kind of the beginning of July. That's when most of these will flower. Right now it just looks kind of dead because they're done flowering and they're starting to spread their seed pods, and you can see over here there's some thistle patches that are spreading those seed pods as well. My class, wet meadow is your habitat 4. I want you to describe the biotic factors that are here. And also, when you look at the marsh habitat where we just were, I want you to include how the marsh is different from this area and from the right area. Mrs. Anderson's class, what do we need to add?
Okay, you guys are answering question 4 under station 1, so you're comparing the 3 different wetlands. So notice that she talked about the types of plants that are here compared to the types of plants we see in the marsh, and just how the water is a little bit different. It's more seasonal here, whereas in the marsh it's year-round sitting there. Last habitat we're going to look at, this is our disturbed area, which is very fitting with Halloween coming up soon, but it's not that kind of disturbed. It just means that ecologically, either naturally or by people, this area was somehow changed. And you can see that it was changed just to put this road in. So right next to where this path is, we see a lot more bare ground. We see a lot more weeds right here. And then as you go further away from the path, then we start to see a lot more grasses, and we start to see some more flowering plants. But again, right here, a lot more bare ground and some weeds. So when you first take out all of the vegetation in an area, usually the first thing that comes back are these weeds. And then after we get a little bit better soil, then we'll start to see more grasses and more perennials that will stay every year. So this is an example of a human disturbance. A natural disturbance could be a fire that was started by lightning. A really extreme natural disturbance could be a volcano. So those are some types of disturbances you can see.